well. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here today. The major focus, of course, of Bill C-15 is the imposition of mandatory minimum sentences for certain types of drug offenses. And so long as we maintain the criminalization of drugs, it's clear that punishment must be effective. Now, having said that, mandatory minimum sentences do not work to deter criminals who act without foresight or without care for the future. And in my experience and view, drug addicts fall into that category, as do most persons who are charged with and convicted of simple possession. By contrast, criminals who commit crime for profit do consider potential penalties, and they can be deterred as they act with a view to the future and with the intention of profiting from their wrongdoing. And drug traffickers can fall into that category of criminal. As a result, where drug traffickers are concerned, mandatory minimum sentences, properly crafted, can be effective. Now, if we are to have mandatory minimum sentencing, it is critical, in my view, to distinguish between effectively business people and drug addicts. People who are drug addicts, people who have possession issues, ought not to fall under the mandatory minimum sentencing. Bill C-15 is drafted, at least to a degree, in order to meet this distinction between drug users and drug dealers. We see that from the ability of the courts not to impose mandatory sentences in the event that the individual convicted qualifies for and completes drug treatment programs. That may well have the effect of removing drug addicts who sell drugs to pay for their habit from the strictures of the legislation. Similarly, I am glad to see the requirement for a report back to Parliament on the effect of the proposed changes. That will allow for a revision of the legislation to ensure that it meets the requirements of minimizing crime while using incarceration only where necessary. It's very important that we have evidence-based punishments. Now, some issue may be taken with the distinctions drawn by the legislation. The difference between 200 and 201 marijuana plants, for example, is purely arbitrary. That having been said, a line must be drawn somewhere, and wherever the line is drawn, there will be an element of the arbitrary. The aggravating factors suggested, committing the offense in prison, being near a schoolyard, that type of thing, seem to mirror specific issues that have been raised recently, specific concerns. So that's also encouraging. To my mind, the most significant issue, and one issue that must be considered, is whether there will be sufficient resources available to make the proposed legislation a success. If all the legislation is going to do is increase the number of people incarcerated, it really will succeed in doing very little. Another factor to consider is the cost to provinces. As I noted in my brief written remarks, every sentence below 2 years will be served in a provincial institution. Similarly, the bulk of the costs of investigation, legal aid, and the judiciary will be paid for at the provincial level. That's important to note because this is a difficult time financially for many of the provinces. The legislation requires drug treatment programs. These are not inexpensive. Similarly, there must be available funding to ensure that specialized drug courts can continue and be expanded to include the entire country. Such funding may also be difficult in the current economy. We have to recognize also that the new legislation will increase prison populations at both the provincial and federal level, and there must be resources made available so that you can actually have some type of rehabilitation at both levels. The use of drugs cannot be considered in isolation. There must also be resources for youth programs, resources for legal aid, resources for more police officers and peace officers. A couple of final points I'd like to raise. The first, and I have not dealt with this at all in my written materials, but it did strike me, Plea bargaining will be most assuredly impacted by this legislation. There is the opportunity for federal prosecutors to, for example, change the nature of the charge, not in an improper way, but to avoid the strictures of the mandatory minimum sentencing. In order to deal with this, there may be requirements that there be new guidelines given to federal prosecutors which will impact and limit federal prosecutorial discretion. This is something which perhaps has to be dealt with at the ministerial level, but it is a factor that should be considered. Finally, an issue which strikes me is that there is an attempt at the moment to deal in a rather piecemeal way with sentencing, and this is problematic. While I am not supportive of the federal sentencing guidelines in the United States, in my view they are grossly excessive, the concept of having global sentencing guidelines with some discretion in them, but which would apply across the board through the criminal justice system, might well have the effect of establishing greater consistency and fairness and the ability to look closely at the effect of sentencing so that we can have some evidence-based results. The purpose is to minimize crime, not simply to punish. Thank you.
Thank you very much.